So, right, okay, so I love science. I just think it's often sold, isn't it, like a box of broccoli. It's good for you. You ought to do it. But for me, it's always been a box of delights. You open it and there are immediately 100 other doors that open and you want to go through all of them. So I've always loved science, and the trouble with me is that the thing that I get a real buzz out of is finding some really complex piece of science and being able to explain it. And the thing that gives me more pleasure than anything else is when you hear somebody say, after you've explained something, I never understood that until now. So that's what I love about science, and I'm eternally curious. So science has been a great part of my life, and although I was actually the world's worst bench scientist, in fact, can I tell you a secret? I broke so much equipment that I was asked to stop doing practicals because they couldn't afford to teach me because I broke so much glassware. Anyway, so I've come to talk to you about science in the media. Science in the media hasn't always been a very happy story. Now, we are, as you know, completely obsessed with breakthroughs. A cure for all cancers on the way, that is a classic breakthrough headline. A daily pill to cure diabetes. A magic pill to keep you slim. We do like magic pills. Here's another one. Arthritis pill breakthrough. And this one, new jab to cure misery of back pain. All these front pages are there because actually for these particular newspapers' readers, this is what they want to hear about. You know, arthritis, diabetes. There are a lot of obese, arthritic people reading these particular newspapers who desperately want to hear these things. So breakthroughs is the stuff that we are particularly well known for. By the way, I put that last one up just to show you that if you ever read a Daily Mail headline that has a question mark at the end of the headline, the answer is always, ladies and gentlemen, no. So, scares. We're also particularly good at scares. Frankenfoods was one that was the media, we just ran with it. It was a gift. And it's a bit, Frankenfoods that shares something with fracking in that the word is just a gift for headlines. It's fracking awful. I mean, it's just a gift. And so Frankenfoods, any variation on Franken you could possibly find, found its way into newspapers. And you won't be able to read this, but here's a piece. This one is actually from the Mail. And it says actually some things that you might think are rather good. For instance, African cattle that are less vulnerable to sleeping sickness, thanks to genes from a baboon. But they've somehow kind of put that into being bad. And the headline, I wanted to show that to you because it's the headline that makes something that actually is really very important suddenly seem bad simply because of that headline. So, science isn't all bad in the newspaper. Anyone tell me what that is? Large Hadron Collider. Oh, of course it is. And can I just put up? Ah, there he is. Bless. I work with it. I get to work with him quite a lot. So, Large Hadron Collider, and everybody is fascinated by the Large Hadron Collider, and of course by Brian. And when the Large Hadron Collider was on the front of the Times editor told me that they sold 50,000 more copies a day. So people are very interested in science, and I want you to note this because they're very interested in something that is very complicated, very difficult to explain, and actually you'd be hard pushed to say there is a use for the Large Hadron Collider or the application for it. So people are interested in things that are complicated if they're well explained. by our boy here. So you won't again be able to read this, apologies. This is about the cervical cancer vaccine, HPV vaccine. In fact, I was on the committee, the Joint Committee on Vaccination, that advised putting this into use. And there was a determined onslaught from the Mail. Now, the Mail, the Mail famously runs headlines that are, you know, coffee is good for you one day and coffee is bad for you the next day. But on cervical cancer, they completely surpassed themselves, because in their Irish edition, they were running a campaign to have the cervical cancer vaccine introduced, because it wasn't going to be introduced in Ireland, whereas in Britain, they were running headlines saying we mustn't have it introduced. So they were both having their cake and eating it. And this story was about, the headline here says, girl left in waking coma and sleeps for 23 hours a day after severe reaction to cervical cancer jab. Scary, really scary stuff. And do these things matter? I mean, here was what the Express ran. Jab is as deadly as the cancer. I mean, it's an extraordinary headline. And if you read that, you really would be very frightened. And you could say, well, does it really matter? These are mad headlines. Surely people don't believe them. Well, actually, it really does matter if people believe those sort of headlines. Cervical cancer vaccine was induced, well, HPV vaccine rather, was introduced in 2009. And at the time, the evidence of the impact of that vaccine had been modelled, but obviously models don't always work out. But actually, the real results came in 2013, and introducing that vaccine caused a 70% drop in the incidence of cervical cancer amongst vaccinated schoolgirls. So that's an extraordinary drop. That vaccine has had a fantastic impact. And yet those sorts of headlines were making people really worried about whether they should let their teenage girls have the vaccine. So it really does matter. And the classic story where it mattered was MMR. And I want to tell you that it didn't actually start in the media. It started in the respectable science press, because it was the Lancet. I mean, it wasn't just us making it up. The Lancet ran a small case report by Andrew Wakefield, who then had a press conference at which he suddenly said, oh, and by the way, I think that it might cause, triple jab might cause autism. And after that, there were no holds barred. It was a story that went nuclear in every sense of the word. There have been lots of analysis of why that happened, but the consequence was that. That's what happened. The number of cases of measles shot up, and it was particularly noticeable that there was an outbreak in Swansea, and it was a town where there was a local newspaper who had campaigned vociferously against introduction of the MMR vaccine, and saying that it caused autism. So what the media says about the science of stories, of health stories, really has real-world consequences. So why do you get very poor science content in relation to some of these stories? And actually, it's a very complicated set of reasons why. One of the things is about balance. Now, we're all told as journalists that we must have balance. It's written into the BBC Charter. We must be balanced. But what we tend to do is we tend to present balance in a really peculiar way. So that if there are 99 people for something and one person against it, we will present it as if it's of equal balance, which is quite wrong and really, it's really confusing to the public. And that's exactly what happened with MMR. And more than that, something else that happened is we love a maverick. We love an underdog. Anybody, David and Goliath, we'd be on David's side every time. And why that happens, and what happens as a consequence of that, is that you get somebody who is a maverick who actually doesn't care, and they will enjoy the press attention. Meanwhile, serious scientists run away. And I always remember at the time of the MMR vaccine furore that there were lots of scientists who could tell you all the things that people needed to know about the MMR vaccine, but would they go into a studio with Andrew Wakefield? No, they wouldn't. And they would say things like, oh, it's only giving him the oxygen of publicity. And actually what you need to know in science communication is that if scientists allow a vacuum to be created in which there is no good quality information, madmen will fill it. And there are all sorts of people ringing up the BBC, coming into newspapers, sending emails to journalists saying, we'd like to comment. And their views are so mad that actually when you've got nothing to print, you print mad stuff because that's what's coming in. So we love a maverick and we love emotion and personal stories. And what you had with MMR, and you see it in lots of health and science stories where people disagree, is that you will have a personal story. And the personal story is incredibly important to us all. If your neighbour says, oh, this happened to me, it might be wrong, but actually that's what you remember because it's personal experience and it's told to you. And so therefore it has much more saliency. And the emotional side of things is what journalists thrive on. We don't want to produce stuff that is devoid of emotion because emotion is actually what colours our reading. It's why we read novels. It's because we want to get some feeling from what we're reading. Stories of heartbreak, TOTs. TOTs? TOT stands for Triumph Over Tragedy. We do like a good TOT. So all of those things we want to put in. And another reason why science stories go wrong is where agendas become political. So one of the things that went wrong with MMR is that it became a stick with which some of the newspapers could beat the government of the day. And you remember all the witch hunt about whether Leo Blair had or had not had his MMR vaccine. So science is then used for a completely different agenda. And I was saying before about madmen streaming into vacuums, but when you have a controversial story, the people who are making the most song and dance about something usually are extremely well organised, have a very effective media strategy. They have very good media spokespeople. They make very good copy. They make very good television. These are the people who are really dedicated to getting their side of the argument across. And I think one of the things about the media reporting of science is that very often you feel that a view is much more important than it really is. And if you went out and you asked 100 people what they thought of cloning or all sorts of things, you would find that there was much more acceptance than you would be led to believe from reading newspapers. But it's partly because agendas are dictated by people with very strong vested interests one way or another. And polarised views, there are an awful lot of issues in which science is involved, in which there are polarised views. And actually, the science doesn't matter in those cases because it becomes about belief. People have beliefs, for instance, about vaccination, which some kind and decent people think that if they provided more information, then these people would change their views. They absolutely won't. You provide more information and it only reinforces their view that they had before. So more information and education for those particular group is not the answer. We're very bad about misleading headlines. We really are. Hands up. And I showed you an example earlier of a misleading headline. You know, Frankenstein's farmyard, of something that was really very important. And misunderstanding of the science, I've put right at the bottom of this list, because it's not often that actually the science is deliberately misunderstood. Journalists hate to get things wrong. Some of you might feel that we deliberately get things wrong, but we do hate to get things wrong. And if we do get things wrong, I think, how many of you are scientists here? Quite a lot of you. If you ever see something that's wrong in a newspaper, the science is wrong, don't write a ranty 4-page letter saying, what a fool you are. Just write one paragraph saying, I think you may have misunderstood. Can I tell you about this? And just in a very short paragraph. I promise you that journalists will never ever make the same mistake again. They've simply misunderstood. Poor grasp of statistics. How many of you do statistics in your daily life? How many of you would rather jump over hot coals than do statistics? Well, one of the problems about statistics is that, Tim Harford is the great man on this, or David Spiegelhalter, but one of the great things about statistics is that we really are very poor at grappling with statistics and then putting across risk. We are risk illiterate, journalists and the public. We really don't get risk at all. We don't understand it. And sometimes journalists are deliberately led up the garden path. And I could show you, I probably get 200 press releases a day, and I could show you at least 3/4 of them that have misleading statistics in them. Very often, one of those things is relative risk and absolute risk. And people like to quote relative risk because very often it bigs up their research. It makes it look much more important than it really is. And we, poor suckers that we are, desperate to get our page in the paper that day, will go with a misleading statistic because after all, that's what's printed out in the press release that has come from a research council, a university, a pharmaceutical company. All of them are at it. They're all trying to make their research bigger and better than it really is. And often journalists really aren't sharp enough about interrogating the statistics. And therefore, there's a misleading sense of risk. So, MMR, I just thought I'd finish with the MMR. Of course, the end of the story was that Andrew Wakefield's paper was retracted by The Lancet, and there were all the headlines from the very papers that had started in the first place. No apology ever from the Daily Mail note, saying that it was withdrawn. There was still a lot of conspiracy theory going on the internet that Andrew Wakefield really was hard done by. The fact that he had a financial interest in a single vaccine was really his undoing, I think. And the truth was exposed by a journalist in the end. And that was Brian Deere, who's here. And it took him a very, very long time to dig through the bottom of it. So journalism did triumph in the end, but it was very, very poor showing by us for a long time. And I think it's one of the worst examples of poor science reporting, because it did have, it made children sick. There is no getting away from it. The reporting that the media was responsible made children very sick, and far too many of them. And dishonest, unethical and callous was the verdict on Wakefield by the GMC. So, is it a tale of two cultures? Or is it something else? How many of you are fans of Ben Goldacre? Well, Ben Goldacre, I have to say is a friend of mine, but Ben would say that the media is ruled by humanities graduates, and that humanities graduates are a kind of scourge upon the earth, and they just don't understand science. And if only there were scientists in newspapers, then it would all be marvellous. So, I think this is very interesting. This is something that comes from Kevin Marsh, who was the editor of the Today programme. It isn't lack of knowledge that makes science a problem for journalists. It's a question of incompatibility. Journalism seeks out what's different, what challenges expectations, what's new. Science seeks out what's the same, what confirms expectations or hypotheses, what's the norm. So we think in very, very different ways. So let me just do a bit of compare and contrast. So scientists write the conclusion last in a science paper, and they're interested in all the data and all the news. They wait until publication to release the results. And they often think that the media's purpose is to educate. I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that when I went into the newsroom of the News of the World, the news editor did not sit us down at conference every morning and say, "What shall we educate the public about today then?" That was not what he said. So, compare and contrast with journalism. We write the conclusion first, not last. We're not interested in good news. We're much, much more interested in bad news. And actually, those of you who feel rather smug and say, "Ooh, they're only interested in good news," how many of us buy newspapers when there's a big headline about a disaster, or switch on the television when there's a big explosion or accident or whatever it is? We read the papers, we return to the media when it's bad news. In general, unless it's us winning the Olympic bid, or we don't switch on the media for good news. We want to know that Daniel Craig ran off with Sienna Miller. Sir, you look as if you don't want to know that. Anyway, I was riveted. And, you know, sorry, I'm talking to the girls here. Which of us was not fascinated by Nigella Lawson? It was, how can you not read a story that talks of lifestyles that are so alien? I digress. So, and we can't wait 2 seconds before telling someone else. Actually, you always knew, when you walk through a newspaper office, you always knew if there's a fantastic story that's about to break, because people would walk through the news desk area, and you'd see them saying, "No, really?" That was a good story. And we can't resist telling people. And actually, that's why I think scientists and journalists, are very similar. Because we want, and I have kind of both genes, and I want to tell people about science. I can't resist. If I come across a really fascinating piece of science, I will stop literally people in the street and tell them about this and how fantastic it was. And journalists do that too. We're curious, we're driven by it. we think the media's purpose is to sell newspapers, or if we're online, to be there first with the news. Now, people always have a kind of, scientists often say to me, you only do it to sell newspapers. It's almost as if you walked into Tesco and say, you only do it to sell baked beans. Well, of course, that's what we're there to do. But actually, if we did what scientists sometimes want us to do, which is to educate the public, would people read the newspaper or watch the TV if we were school? No, they wouldn't. And actually, sometimes when you see media doing science, I always remember when the Human Genome Project, the first draft was announced in 2000, the best coverage by far was the Daily Mirror. The Daily Mirror ran a 2-page spread on what the Human Genome Project meant, what it was. They explained the science, all in about 250-word chunks. And it was a supreme example of science communication. It was fantastic, absolutely fantastic. So education comes as a kind of byproduct of big news stories, but it's not what we're there to do. What we're there to do, I think, is to be the fourth estate. We're there to challenge science. We're not there to collude with science. And some of you might disagree with that, but I think our role is to challenge, to make sure that what's said is being true, and all of those sorts of things. So, is science too hard? Is that why there are so many problems? After all, it is really complex. But remember our lovely Brian Cox and the Large Hadron Collider. I mean, that's very complex, but it's still, people lap it up. Dinosaurs are really complicated. You all know 6-year-olds that can give you the names of 25 incredibly multi-syllabled dinosaur names. And they know everything there is about them. So there's lots of complexity. Astronomy, again, people are fascinated by astronomy. But there are scientists who say, well, again, this is the Ben Goldacre thing, that humanities graduates shouldn't be science correspondents because they can't possibly understand science. But actually, it's a bit like saying, OK, we can't understand that other incredibly complicated thing, pensions. How many of you understand pensions? Be honest. How many of you understand pensions? Yeah, I thought so. But actually, if I said to all of you, OK, I want you to wrap a wet towel around your head, and I want you to go and research pensions. If I said to you, actually, you're a humanities graduate, you can't do it, you'd probably get very cross, and quite rightly. We can all assimilate difficult information if and when we need to. The pensions thing, though, is we don't need to until the very last minute, or so we think. And so we let people get away with robbing us blind. But so, and in this case, we're grateful for the newspapers running pension headlines about swindles, because we're grateful that somebody understands it and knows that someone's robbing us, because we haven't clocked it yet. So I don't think that only the science trained should do science reporting. And in fact, I think some of the best science reporters are not scientists. Mark Henderson, who was a science editor of the Times, was a history graduate. He was a superb science reporter. What we're good at in journalism is distilling stuff, getting to the essence of it. We want a good quote from a scientist, but actually we're better than you are generally at summarising your work in general. And in fact, if you look at the paper every day, I talked about breakthroughs and scares, but there's a lot of good science stories in the newspapers. The report today, peanut allergy, thank you. Thank you. Peanut allergy. I've got to do 950 words before the end of today on that. So peanut allergy. So a good story and actually really well reported. And actually, if you look at every day, there are lots of really good science stories which are well reported. And they're not kind of controversial science stories. They're, gosh, did you know that? Oh, isn't that interesting? We do lots of those sorts of science stories and we do them really well. But as I said, the ones that get really bad are the ones where the political things get involved. And of course, the Cox effect. Oh, bless. But he's done a little equation there. He likes writing equations. None of us know what they mean, but he writes a lot of equations. Does that in the BBC as well, writes a lot of equations. And Robin Ince just pokes him with a pin and says, stop it. But people have started to do physics. There's been a big rise in the number of people doing physics because of Brian Cox, despite it being difficult. So physics isn't easy, people do it. So I don't think that science in the media is badly reported because it's hard. So is it because it's misunderstood? Well, there are some misconceptions about science. For instance, that it advances by big breakthroughs, and actually it doesn't. It's step by step by step, building on the advances of others. And science doesn't prove things. Mathematicians do proofs. Scientists weigh evidence. That's quite a different thing. And scientists are neutral. Scientists are not neutral. We think of ask a scientist, they'll tell you an honest, unbiased report. There's a gentleman in the back row who thinks that they're not. It's you. They're not biased at all. They're not neutral at all. They're as biased as any one of the rest of us. And there's this other thing about the lone genius. I do not know a single scientist who works on their own. Scientists work in teams. They really do. And scientists are not always truthful. I'm sorry to say this of them, because a lot of them are very nice, but they are not always truthful. And they kind of blur things around the edges, just like everyone else does. Because they want more funding for their science. You know, the same reason all the rest of us tell little white lies. So I think that science reporting in some senses is only going to get worse, because the declining sales of print, and actually the online as well. BBC journalists who work for BBC Online have to turn around a story in something like 24 minutes. That is very fast to get an accurate copy. And what the declining sales of print have meant is that there are a lot fewer specialist correspondents who know the science beat. And we have this phenomenon now known as journalism. So journalism is where, you know, you are that lone person on the science desk in a newspaper, and you have to write 6 stories, and stuff comes in from all the big journals. You think, well, it must be all right, it's come from the big journals, it's come from Salford University, it must be absolutely marvellous. And they send you a really nice press release, because there are a lot of folk now in press offices, in universities all around the country, sending out stuff which is high quality, and it just gets cut and pasted into the newspaper. Is that good journalism? I'm not sure that it is. And there is this extraordinary rise in irrationality, or is it just me getting older? It's bizarre. I mean, you only have to look at the internet for 5 minutes to think, am I not normal, or is it them? It is extraordinary what people believe. Conspiracy theorists, the irrationality, and actually that kind of stuff you can't educate people out of. Like I said before, it's a belief system. Lobbying by interest groups is just enormous. There are extraordinarily well-funded, just think of climate science, very, very well-funded lobby groups who put a lot of very professional effort into changing the stories that are written in newspapers. And I think science needs informed challenge. Although I work with scientists all the time, I would never say to them, they are an undiluted bunch of joy. You know, there are things that need challenging in science, and you need good science journalists to be able to get to the bottom of it and do it. And we've got Brian. I picked that one. He looked very cute in that one, don't you think? Very cute in that one. So there is good news, though. The good news is that increasingly we are seeing people who go into newspapers and into the media educated as to the sort of thing that constitute good evidence and whether they should do it. So the bottom one, you know, how excited should I be? You know, the top is holy crap and the bottom is yawn. And the yawn is just opinion, and it goes up through case reports, case series, case controlled studies, cohort studies, RCTs, and finally at the top, systematic review of RCTs with or without meta-analysis. So there's a kind of hierarchy of evidence, but we do need to help people understand that. And riding to the rescue is the Science Media Centre. The Science Media Centre was set up a decade ago, just celebrated its 10th birthday last year. And the Science Media was set up very simply for when science meets the headlines. Because that's one of the really difficult things, is when you have a piece of science that goes political. I mean, GM crops are a classical thing. Then you get non-specialists reporting it, specialists who perhaps don't know the people to go to. So I have a little black book, well, or a virtual black book on my iPad, which is probably 3,000 or 4,000 names. And it's people that I can ring up and say, look, this paper's come out in Nature, tell me, is it shit or is it sugar? And people will be honest and say, well, actually, I think it's rubbish, or actually, no, this is really exciting. And journalists rely on having those sort of networks to be able to tell us whether something is really, because after all, remember, my specialism is life sciences and medicine, and particularly genetics. But thank goodness for Brian Cox, because I do not understand the first word about astronomy. It is a black hole for me. And if somebody comes to me with stuff about astronomy, I absolutely need to check it, because otherwise I really would be writing complete rubbish. And we can't be experts in everything. We really can't be. So the Science Media Centre maintain a list of about 3,000 scientists who have a whole range of specialties. And when some big thing comes up, they are there and ready. Because the thing you need to know is that events make news. So, for instance, we had the whole thing about Alexander Litvinenko. And nobody was interested in a man who studied polonium-210 at Surrey University until Alexander Litvinenko ate some, at which point he became an incredibly important media resource. And he was on the Science Media Centre's list. And they will, it's been very successful, because now general correspondents will ring up the Science Media Centre. They'll be given a whole range of experts, so there's no selection of experts. They'll have a range of different views, so that at least people are going to people who are genuinely well known in their subject area, and not people who are mad people. This, you won't be able to see it, but this is the Royal Statistical Society. The BBC College of Journalism have now included, for the very reasons we were talking about misreported statistics, they run a statistics element in the BBC College of Journalism. And actually, if you go to the Royal Society of Statistics webpage, they've got some fantastic source material which will take you through all those things like relative risk and absolute risk, and tell you how to read a scientific paper and how to interpret all the data. And it's really, really good. And once you've read something like that, it really equips you for life as a journalist. So actually the statistics course now has been adopted much more widely in the BBC and other news organisations than it just within the science beat. It's being offered to all BBC journalists, and lots of them take it up and find it incredibly helpful. If you, and this is not for the scientists, but if you, the general public, want to check on science, there are some really good places to start. PubMed, it's free, set up originally by the US National Library of Medicine. You just type stuff in there and it comes up with loads of the most recent papers. The Cochrane collaboration also is a library of systematic reviews, fantastically easy to navigate, will tell you the truth. And the European Food Safety Authority, because we do love a food scare more than anything else, European Food Safety Authority, lots and lots of information. So there are sources out there where you can really go to the horse's mouth and get the proper answer. But I'm going to leave you, ladies and gentlemen. I love this picture of him. It's one of his kind of, do you know how he does it in his series? He goes, he has to have one of those poses in every one of his television series, because actually the face of science, I think there are many, many people who are interested and fascinated by science. And, you know, Brian leads the charge of all those people. Meanwhile, I think it's for journalists like me who work on the science beat to try and do all we can to improve the reporting of science in the media. Because I hope I've persuaded you that actually how science in the media is reported is incredibly important. Thank you.